I would like to take another look at this period of approximately 1870 to 1914. I would like to take a look at it from the other side of the market, from the demand side. And so here what we have are problems of mass marketing. This is the marketing side, more fun probably than the production or supply side of the market. Well, last time before that talked about the rise of large-scale production as these new methods were brought in, new materials brought in, huge increases in the amount of goods that are being produced, and in many cases at lower and lower prices. Well, that was only part of the problems of the people who were running these large companies. You could control production. You could schedule production. But many of these companies began to run into two sets of problems. The first one was coordinating production with purchasing, the buying of raw materials, sub-assemblies, intermediate goods, whatever. You could buy these raw materials on the open market. If you were, for example, a flour miller, there was a very well-organized market where you could buy wheat, the raw material for making your flour, so that the products were available. The problem was coordinating the purchasing with production. There were problems of buying the right quantity of the raw material at the right time. There were problems with fluctuating quality, which affected how efficiently you operated your plants and what your final product looked like. There might, if there's seasonality in prices, there might be a problem with pricing, and you really needed a lot of the raw material. Was the very time of the year when they were most expensive. There might be problems with getting enough transportation to move the raw material to your plant. Problems of storage. A number of problems involved when you bought raw materials on the open market, on the spot market. What a number of companies did is they tried to integrate backward to try to control at least some of their purchases of inputs, of raw materials. Steel companies bought, again, iron ore mines, they bought coal mines, they bought barge companies, they bought railroads, they bought companies that made coke from coal. So they tried to control as much of the process into the plant as they could. And there was a number of moves in a number of other industries to do this. Some manufacturers, again, have already tried to directly buy up the raw material control the source. Oil companies are trying to own oil wells. Aluminum companies, Alcoa, that bought up every new bauxite site, the source of aluminum. So that was one set of problems. The second set of problems was selling the product. Huge increase in production, huge increase in output, and what a number of companies, the problem they began to run across towards the end of the 19th century is industry supply. As big new plants were being built, lots of new capacity coming on stream, is industry supply was growing faster than demand. That created the problem of selling. Well, the traditional way you sold the product was that you contracted with independent reps, you contracted with local wholesalers, some of whom were wholesalers and retailers who would sell your product, sometimes would sell your product and competing products. They would concentrate sometimes in a product line, a product area, rather than by company. They would then redistribute the products to a large number of small stores in their marketing area. You had no control over that. You had no control over the independent distributors, the wholesalers, the retailers. You, in effect, were at their mercy. Now, a company like Singer, of course, short-circuited all that by setting up their own stores. But there's a special reason, is that they also had to educate potential customers on how to use sewing machines. They had to have classes. They had to provide a number of services to potential customers. It was also where if your machine broke down, you had to have a place to bring your machine to get it repaired. So a number of companies ran across this problem was that they found it difficult to coordinate production with selling. And remember, in order to make money, you've got to run a lot of raw material through your plant. You've got to produce a high volume at low unit cost. That means you have to sell a high volume. You don't want it just stacked up in inventory somewhere. So more and more companies were faced with this problem of how do you sell the stuff, these rapidly increasing volumes of products, consumer goods particularly. Well, the market was expanding. It wasn't like you were trying to sell more to a stagnant market. A rapid increase in population, a rapid increase in income. But it wasn't just the size of the market that was changing. It was the structure of the market that was changing, because at the same time, America was rapidly urbanizing. Where the big growth was were in urban markets. And your customers, if you were selling consumer products, ready-made clothes, certain kinds of food, number of leisure goods, your customers were changing. Because more and more, your market, the people who bought your products, were a rapidly increasing, in some ways new group of customers. These were urban, middle-class women who had education, they were literate, they had at least some leisure, and certainly more than, say, a woman on a farm, and they had money. So this was a new group of customers. And how do you sell to them? How do you market this rapidly growing supply of consumer goods to this market? What came out of this, just as facing production coordination problems led to mass production, what came out of this was mass merchandising, the kind of way products are marketed and sold today. And the key to this was a new way to sell products. And that new way to sell products was through a department store. This was an innovation of this period. The first department store, well, there's a lot of controversy on what was the first department store. Probably the first recognizable department store, in fact, wasn't American. The first one was probably Bon Marché in France. Department stores, however, didn't really catch on very much in Europe for a variety of social reasons. And the first big department stores, to a large extent, really catered not to the masses. They really catered to the new upper middle class. They used phrases like the democratization of luxury. In other words, these were styles that the upper classes were adopting, and then they would filter down to the upper middle class that had enough money, again, to buy the relatively expensive products. Bon Marché, some of these are still with us. Bon Marché, Galeria Lafayette, which at one time had a store in Trump Tower. This is not your French version of Kmart. Harrods, Selfridges. But when the department store was developed in America, the social system was different. The income was more equally distributed. There was a larger market. There were more people that more families that in fact could afford some of the new convenience goods, some of the new leisure goods that were being produced. So American department stores did not just cater to the upper middle class. In fact, they were much more democratic. They were willing to sell products to anybody who could afford to come in and buy them. And they carried such a wide variety of products that just about anybody, in fact, could find something in a department store. The first recognizable department store in the United States was put up by a man by the name of A.T. Stewart in 1846 down at the corner of Chamber and Broadway. It was a roaring success. It was a large store. Most stores were very small, tend to be dark. And what evolved was the modern department store with a number of innovations that were brought together. The first thing was the store itself was attractive. This was a large store, a dome through the middle of it, a rotunda, lots of light, plate glass windows, which were possible because of some of the new building techniques. A lot of light. A lot of people in the cities, of course, spent most of their time in fairly dark, dingy apartments or dark, dingy factories. And being able to walk into a well-lit department store was part of the pleasure of shopping. So that was the first thing. The store itself was attractive. You went to the store to see the store, to be in this attractive store. The second thing was the organization of the products into, not surprisingly, departments. Is that it wasn't all just jumbled up. Is that you knew if you wanted to buy something, you could tell very easily where to go, and you could find a wide variety of the product in one place. The next innovation was the products had prices on them, and that was very important. If you went into a fancy shop, there was no prices on the product. The carriage trade, people who own carriages come and stop in front of these shops. There were no prices on the product. So particularly if you didn't have a lot of money, you could be embarrassed. You could say, oh, I really want to buy that dress, and then you find out it's too expensive and you can't afford it. Well, you weren't embarrassed in a department store because all the products had the prices right there on the product. You could tell right away without asking someone whether or not you could afford to buy it. There also was service. This is something the department stores today have forgotten what made them rich to start with, which was service. Lots and lots and lots of service. Excuse me, sales clerks who knew the merchandise, who could answer questions. A number of other services related to shopping. For example, books were a major product line in these stores, so there would be a reading room, kind of like what Barnes & Noble has gotten back to today. A place you could sit down and read through a book, things like that. So shopping became the kind of experience, and the fact that it is still today. It wasn't just going to buy something, but in fact it was a pleasurable experience. Retailers understood the social side. The good retailers understood the social side of retailing, of mass retailing, that this was also not just people coming to buy products, but was a social and leisure experience. Some retailers understood that department stores, in fact, perform some of the functions of community centers, an idea that's carried over into suburban shopping malls. So, attract a lot of customers, nice store, lots of merchandise. You sell it at relatively low prices with low markups, and you hope for very high turnover, mass merchandising. You can move a lot of product through a department store. So the department store owners could then go back to the big manufacturers and say, look, I can move a lot of your product, but you have to give me a discount. You don't have to deal with a lot of independent guys and have all the cost involved with that. You sell a lot of your product to me, I can sell it through my store, but you have to give me a discount. You've got to pass on some of your cost savings to me. I'll pass them on to my customers. Low prices, low markups. We'll push a lot of product. High turnover. And it worked, not surprisingly. A.T. Stewart then built a second store in New York in 1862, which became like the model for the urban department store. It was built out of cast iron on the outside. It was built in such a way, large plate glass windows, again, for display, although he didn't believe in display, to allow light in, a big glass dome once more, a lot of light inside, well-organized departments. That building, by the way, was built, it's still there, it was built between Broadway and 4th Avenue, which is now Lafayette, near Astor Place, between 9th and 10th. And the reason I know that, the fact that that building is still there, is that a few years ago my wife worked in that building, and neither of us realized this was A.T. Stewart's department store. It finally dawned upon me what this building was. By then it had been changed so much. It was an office building owned by American Express. It was hard to really get a feel for how it was constructed or how it functioned as a department store. Department stores caught on. They were very profitable, and they were able to, again, fill the needs of this new, relatively affluent group of customers who still, however, did not feel comfortable going into the small boutiques. And at the same time, of course, were able to solve the problems of the large producers by moving great amounts of good through department stores. Early department stores are still with us today. Wanamaker's was the one I'm going to talk about. Roland Macy. Lord & Taylor was one of the first. Bloomingdale's. Jordan Marsh. Edward Filene, Marshall Fields. Many of these chains go back well over 100 years. Now, John Wanamaker in Philadelphia probably took this concept further than most, because what Wanamaker did is he created demand. He didn't wait for customers to come into a store. He created demand. And he did it the same way department stores do it today. His major innovation was the newspaper ad. That was possible because the price of newspapers had come way down because of technological innovation in the making of paper, made from wood, cheap wood pulp as opposed to rags, and a whole series of innovations in printing, which allowed just about anybody to afford a newspaper. It became a form of mass communication. The second form of mass communication at the time, by the way, were magazines. Mass circulation magazines were coming in at this time. And so interestingly enough, the ones with the largest circulation were aimed at women, as of course were the department stores. And Wanamaker took advantage of this. Substantial newspaper advertising to tell people what his new products were, to create demand, to show people what new styles were. He subsidized advice columns to tell people what the new styles were, things like that. In fact, the first advertising agency in the United States was created in Philadelphia in the 1870s in order to write the ad copy for Wanamaker's newspaper ads. But he went further than that. He sponsored all kinds of promotions, including some that were very similar to the Macy's Day Parade. So this idea that you create demand, you create excitement, you tell people about new products, you create new styles so people feel that their old products are out of style, and they throw them out and buy new products that are more in style. All these things became part of mass merchandising of department stores in the last quarter, actually the last half of the 19th century. So that was one solution to the problem of how do you sell this great increase in supply of consumer goods. The second approach was, that's kind of, you can think of that as the sales approach. By the way, there was one interesting consequence of all this. The vast majority of shoppers in the department stores, which were open during the day, were women. And what this did in America, and this was different than in in Europe and the rest of the world, what it did in America is that it created a downtown space where the department stores were, where they tended to cluster. It created a downtown space where there were a lot of women, and that was something very unusual because the city was a place where there were factories, was a place where there were warehouses, there were offices. To a large extent, during the day, cities were places that were dominated by men and dominated by business. The streets, always a bunch of guys hanging out on the streets, guys going up and down in wagons, things like that. It was always men, and for the first time, this created kind of a female space in cities. With some interesting consequences to how we think about urban space and how we think about cities. So there were some social consequences. There's also, some people believe that this also helped with the emancipation of women by allowing them an activity for women to along with some of the other new activities, women's club, an interest in reform, things like that, that created for the first time really in an urban setting a public space for women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, understood what were some of the consequences of an urban space for women. The second approach to this problem of how do you sell lots of products was what we now would call marketing. Companies began to do all those things that we all are familiar with, for better or for worse. They began for the first time to put a brand name on the product. You just didn't sell oats, you sold Quaker Oats. And then you, of course, advertised and promoted the hell out of it to convince everybody that Quaker Oats was better than somebody else's rolled oats. Packaging became important because one of the problems that people had in urban areas was space. They lived in small apartments. Oats used to be sold in 25 and 50-pound bags. Grain in general, in fact, was sold in large bags. You couldn't sell a 50-pound bag to someone who had a small apartment. So what Quaker Oats did was come up with their famous cylinder because it was small. You could sell a really small amount, put it on a shelf, didn't take up too much space. So packaging became important, size of the package. And then, of course, you could put your name on the package. Promotion. Companies like Quaker did all those things we're familiar with today. They had celebrities endorse the product. They had doctors say about how you're going to live longer and be healthier if you use the product. And on, all the stuff that we're familiar with today. In fact, Quaker Oats was the first company to put a little prize inside the box. All that stuff breakfast cereal companies do today was all done by Quaker. They sponsored events, various kinds of sporting events, like later on car races. So all that kind of marketing that is there today really evolved, really began. This type of mass marketing really began during this period. Much more sophisticated ads in magazines, for example, things like that. So mass marketing, creating demand. Mass merchandising, being able to sell a large amount of product, low markup, but high turnover, was really the market side answer to this problem of large-scale production and then how to move out the product. And again, it kind of changed, certainly it changed the environment in which we live. So the urban environment physically changed, again, because of the coming of department stores, and the way products are sold changed. And most of those changes were already in place by 1900. This lecture is about the automobile industry. Specifically, it's about the origins and the early development of the automobile industry. It's possible here, as in some of the other lectures, to personalize the story and really talk about the key people involved here. And that comes down to two names: Henry Ford, Ford Motor Company, and Alfred Sloan of General Motors. There are a number of themes in talking about the origins and development of the automobile industry, particularly when contrasting Ford and GM, contrasting Henry Ford and Alfred Sloan. Probably, I don't know how you would debate this, but probably no industry has had such a pervasive effect on how we live in the 20th century as the automobile industry. And that is due to Henry Ford. So as an individual, probably no one person has had as much impact on his century as Henry Ford. However, if you look at the internal history, the industrial history of the automobile industry, you get a different picture than the effects of what Henry Ford did. Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company was really the culmination, the extreme application of the American system of manufacturing. The evolution of the American system of manufacturing into the system of mass production. And what happened to Henry Ford, and Ford showed that this system had a logical conclusion, or maybe somewhat more dramatically, had a dead end. Alfred Sloan and General Motors indicates an adaptation of this type of production system to a different kind of world than the kind of world that Henry Ford saw, the kind of world he carried around in his mind. In many ways, Henry Ford is the last of the great 19th century mechanics, and Alfred Sloan is the first of the 20th century corporate managers. So let's take a look at that. Henry Ford was born in 1863. Henry Ford was born in the middle of the Civil War. He was born on a farm near what is now Dearborn, where the Ford Museum is, the Dearborn Museum is. Like a lot of other farm boys, he hated it. He liked to play with machinery, but boy did he hate farming. And as early as he could, as a young teenager, he left the farm to become an apprentice mechanic, in fact. And the story of Henry Ford's early life is, again, fairly common for mechanics. Itinerant, a lot of movement, going from job to job, from place to place, fixing machinery, learning new skills. At one point, Henry Ford worked for Detroit Edison, one of the operating branches of Thomas Edison's company. And in fact, before he began making cars, there is a story, may or may not be true, of Ford meeting Edison and Edison encouraging him to continue playing with the internal combustion engine. That may or may not be true. Later in life, they became very good friends after Ford became famous. Ford gravitated in a very slow kind of way towards Detroit and towards this new automobile industry. Well, in the early 1900s, the automobile industry was basically a craft industry. Cars were basically made by hand, were assembled by hand, parts were fitted. Automobiles were very expensive. They tended to be considered the playthings of the rich. They could cost as much as $2,000. Again, in a period when most people, semi-skilled, skilled workers made $10 to $15 a week. So these were expensive luxury products. There were some people who already were talking about making more cars in a more efficient way and selling them for a lower price. Ransom Oldsmobile, for example. But that's the dominant way automobiles were made. Early in the 1900s, however, Henry Ford, who, by the way, at one time also worked in a bicycle shop, so was familiar with some of the similar technology. Henry Ford began to think about the idea of a democratic car, a mass-produced car that was simple, that was rugged, that cost less money than even the cars made with high volumes at the times, usually in the hundreds. He began to think about that. He kind of knew what he wanted as the end product, the kind of car he wanted. He started designing these types of cars, but he really didn't have a very good idea how to go about making it. The kind of production system that he needed in order to make the car. His first attempt at automobile manufacturing was that he was brought in, he was recognized as a good mechanic, with an interest in designing cars. He was brought in as a partner of a company that wanted to make cars in the early 1900s. And he began to say, well, look, what we ought to do is we ought to mass produce lots of cars at a low price, at a low cost, and then sell them at a low price. His partners, however, disagreed, and they had an argument about that. The reason was because his partners had brought in a production man to actually make the car. And the production man was a man named Henry Leland, who had had extensive experience as a New England mechanic and production manager. In fact, for many years, he was the production manager for one of the larger sewing machine manufacturers in New England. And he knew about the Army system. He knew about how to mass produce high quality machines. So he was brought in to do that, to produce a high quality car. The idea was that was still where the market was, but to produce it using the manufacturing techniques of New England. The car that he designed and began to produce, in fact, was a high quality car. It did seem to it was more durable. It lasted longer, didn't break down as much as some of the other cars. And that car was the Cadillac. It's the beginning of Cadillac Motors. Ford eventually, because he disagreed with this strategy, was squeezed out. He had no money, pretty well at the end of his rope. He was over 40 years old by this time. And it looked like he just wasn't going to really be going anywhere. His second attempt at producing a car, of course, was he was in charge, and he had been working with a number of designs, a number of prototypes, somewhat prosaically. They were called Model A, Model B, Model C, Model D, and on and on. And the one, of course, that he actually put into production was Model T. And it was this car that revolutionized the automobile industry, the Model T Ford. The Model T Ford was what Ford wanted. It was a relatively simple machine. It was rugged. Ford thought his major market were going to be farmers. He wanted to break the isolation of farmers in the Midwest from small towns. This would give them a way to get from their farms to the small towns. What he knew was that rural roads were terrible, they were rutted, they were muddy, they were dusty, and the automobile had to be able to function in that kind of very hostile environment. So it had to be very rugged, but it had to be simple. It had to be a car that a farmer could follow a simple manual and fix it himself. Far away from repair shops again, and also had to be keep the total cost of the car down. The problem was how to manufacture the car. And Ford had learned something from Leland, and had learned something from other people he began talking to. He realized that by using large amounts of specialized machinery, by not relying on expensive labor to do hand fitting and hand finishing, if he could produce a large volume of cars, if the market was there, and that was a big if the market was there and he could produce a large volume of cars at a low unit cost, that's exactly what he wanted to do. That's how he was going to get rich. So he and a very talented group of mechanics and engineers that also shared his vision began to do that. They designed the car, both aimed at this mass market, but they designed the car and they continued to improve on the design of the car, keeping in mind the way it was going to be produced and how much it was going to cost to produce it. Could this car be produced using existing machinery? What kinds of machinery? Sometimes they found out that the machinery they wanted didn't exist, so they designed the machines. They designed very specialized machines that lowered the cost of making the parts to go into their cars. So it was this evolution of the product and the production system simultaneously that was going to lead to the tremendous success of the Model T Ford. When Ford started out, 1906, 1907, he was thinking in terms of producing tens of thousands of cars a year, which was a huge volume. His car was so successful, so quickly, that very quickly, within only a couple of years, the people at Ford, the engineers at Ford, began to plan to produce hundreds of thousands of automobiles a year as the price kept coming down. And Ford believed in, if you lower the cost, you lower the price, you expand the market. You don't make as much per car, but you make it up, of course, by selling a tremendously increased volume of cars. He understood the concept of elastic demand. They were thinking in terms of producing hundreds of thousands of cars. So they geared up for a very large and very sophisticated manufacturing plant, the Highland Park plant, which came online in 1912, 1913. To produce hundreds of thousands of cars a year rather than tens of thousands of cars. The Highland plant had everything in it that they had learned, that they had improved on in their other smaller plants. Tremendous production capacity, volume production, mass production. The bottleneck, the problem they were facing was not producing the parts. The problem was assembling the parts. Now, they had virtually eliminated hand fitting. It was an assembly operation. The problem was that cars were still fairly complicated pieces of machinery, so that it took a lot of labor, a lot of time to assemble, to do the sub-assemblies of the individual parts of the car, things like magnetos, brakes, braking systems, things like that. And then it took a lot of time to bring the sub-assemblies together on the final assembly line where the chassis and the body came together and put it all together, assemble it all, and get it out the door. That was the bottleneck. That was where there was still a lot of expense, where it slowed down production. They could produce parts faster than they could assemble them. So Ford and his engineers in 1912, 1913 began thinking about that. And what they came up with was the last piece that really led to mass production. And that last piece was the assembly line. The idea was that a group of people did not stand in one place and assemble, get all the parts in one place and then assemble the whole car in one place, or move with the car down an assembly line. That was tried also. The idea was that the workers stay stationary, they have one station, and that the car itself moves down a conveyor belt or a chain conveyor, and when it comes to the station, that person does one small assembly task, and then it continues moving to the next station where something else is added. The modern assembly lines, division of labor and stationary workers with their tools and their parts right there. They don't have to walk around, spend a lot of time trying to find tools, trying to find parts. revolutionized production. Almost immediately, assembly time was cut by 80%. Led to a further reduction in cost, a further reduction in price, and again, an expansion of the market. In 1913, Ford produced about 460,000 cars, again, tooling up in this big Highland Park plant. By 1917, expanding to the absolute limit of his capacity, Ford was producing something around 1.7 million, or a little more than that, in fact, cars and small trucks. So just an explosion of demand from virtually nothing in 1906 and 1907. This was really a small craft industry, and Ford alone in 1917 was producing 1.7 million cars and trucks. Ford was accounting for approximately 3/4 to 80% of all production in the United States. In 1905, Ford was virtually bankrupt. In 1917, Ford was the richest man in America. The story of General Motors is different. One of the early car companies in the early 1900s was Buick, which was a car produced in Flint, Michigan. I can't help smiling. There is a documentary on what happened to Flint called Roger and Me. Highly recommend that you see it. What happens to, on the other end of the story, was car manufacturing implodes in Flint, Michigan, although it hasn't died out. There's still a fair amount of car assembly and manufacturing in Flint. Buick Company starts up in Flint. The bodies were supplied by a carriage maker in Flint owned by a man named William Durant. Billy Durant is one of the more flamboyant characters of the 20th century, although I know very little about his marital and extramarital life. Buick, like most car companies, goes bankrupt. Creditors include Durant, they include banks, and the banks asked Durant to take over Buick, to manage Buick, see if he can salvage something out of this fiasco. By this time, Durant has realized the potential of the automobile industry. That he doesn't know much about making cars. Of course, he knows about making the bodies of cars, carriages. But he has a vision that this is going to be one great big industry. And for him, that means he's going to make a lot of money. But the way he goes about doing it is much different than Henry Ford. Where Durant's talents were in promotion, particularly of himself, and finance. He had a real feel for some of the new ways to finance companies that were becoming more common, the increasingly large role of finance of Wall Street. And what Durant did, rather than concentrating on production like Henry Ford did, what Durant did was he concentrated on building an automobile conglomerate. He went around and bought up little car companies using, again, outside financing. He didn't have the money, of course. Using outside financing, banks, investors, whoever who were willing to finance him, to buy up a number of car companies, to put together this large company made up of independent automobile companies. He also vertically integrated by buying up parts suppliers, companies that made parts, Delco batteries, Champion spark plugs. And then the one acquisition that was going to have a lot of implications for the future of General Motors, Billy Durant bought a company called Hyatt Roller Bearing, which was here in New Jersey. Hyatt Roller Bearing was owned and managed by a local boy named Alfred Sloan. Alfred Sloan was born in Newark, and Alfred Sloan went to MIT, had an engineering degree, which immediately made him much different than most people, even on the production side in the United States. And he owned and ran the Hyatt Bearing Company, which became part of the parts division of General Motors. Well, as long as General Motors expanded, as long as demand expanded, the economy was expanding during this entire period, Billy Durant somehow kept this company afloat despite the huge amount of debt. It made money, it expanded, it looked like it was a large company, certainly nowhere near as big as Ford, but it was a big company. by the standards of the day. So it looks like General Motors was also going to be a big success. And of course, Durant was able to use that perception to borrow more money to buy more companies. General Motors hit the wall a couple times. Durant got kicked out. He was brought back. But finally, after the First World War, there was a short but serious recession in America in 1920-21. Car sales just virtually disappeared. Ford, which was a very wealthy company, just rode right through it. But General Motors basically went bankrupt. Durant had lost control of the company. Every division set their own production levels. They did their own inventory. They did their own marketing. Of course, when sales went down, their inventory skyrocketed. They had a tremendous amount of unsold cars, and the company basically went bankrupt. His little empire collapsed. The bankers kicked him out, and they were looking for somebody to come in to take over and run the company. And that somebody who took over the company were the DuPonts. DuPont was a well-managed company. Again, the three cousins who ran DuPont in the early 1900s were MIT, at least two of them were MIT engineering graduates. One knew about Frederick Taylor's experiments at Midvale. And they had turned a family-owned company that made gunpowder, a boom or bust business, that had made a tremendous amount of money in the First World War, had already begun to diversify, and was looking for new investments. And of course, General Motors looked just perfect for them. GM was one of their customers. They were selling paint to General Motors. And the DuPonts took over General Motors. They began to apply some of the corporate structure they had put in place at DuPont. And where they were moving, they hadn't quite gotten there yet, but where they were moving at DuPont was divisionalization. Most companies, even large ones like Ford, were run the organizational structure was vertical. That is, virtually all information and all major decisions were sent up to the people at the top. Sales managers reported to a sales VP. Production managers reported to a production VP. Everybody reported up to a small group, an executive committee, that met every day at the top, and they pretty well made decisions of how this company was going to be run. As companies got larger and more diverse, and that was the problem at DuPont, as they became larger and more diverse, more and more information was sent up to the top. More and more decisions had to be made by this relatively small group of corporate managers with a relatively small staff. And what was going on was decisions weren't being made. Weren't being made fast enough in a rapidly changing environment. Now, one kind of company had already dealt with this problem, and those were the railroads in the 19th century. Their problem wasn't information coming to the top. Their problem was their companies were becoming spatially distributed over a large amount of miles of track. As railroads got longer and longer, as there were more and more miles of track in some of the big railroads like the Erie and the Pennsylvania, the people at the headquarters realized they just could not react fast enough to the problems that occurred every day in running a railroad. An avalanche on a track, or a derailment, or just keeping up with maintenance, just doing basic maintenance, things like that, could not be directed out of central headquarters. And so what they did was they divided their railroads into divisions. There would be a divisional supervisor, superintendent. The superintendent would have some of the staff support that formerly was managed out of the corporate headquarters. The staff support reported to the superintendent, not to the vice presidents back in New York or back in Philadelphia. So they were forced to divisionalize, and that became part of the model for these more diverse corporations. As DuPont diversified into plastics, diversified into paint, they began to divisionalize. What they realized, though, is they just couldn't let their divisions wander off by themselves. There had to be some kind of overall centralized control and supervision, and that was primarily financial. So DuPont, with its treasurer, Donaldson Brown, began to institute some of the financial reporting and financial controls that have become commonplace in large corporations. Budgeting, planning, rate of return calculations, which had never been done before. So some of that advanced thinking was brought to General Motors to try and get some control over this incredibly sprawling company. But the man who really brought it all together was Alfred Sloan. he wrote in the early 1920s, General Motors was trying to figure out how to compete with Ford, just couldn't do it. Alfred Sloan wrote what is probably the most famous memo in American business history, outlining his plan to how to make General Motors a more competitive company. A lot of it had to do with divisionalization, had to do with financial control, how to organize the company, but part of it also had to do with marketing. And again, looking at Alfred Sloan with the high starched collars, you would never imagine that he would have a flair for marketing, but he did. His basic idea was America had changed. America was not this undifferentiated rural mass that it was in the 19th century, that in fact there had been a tremendous increase in wealth. There had been tremendous growth in the middle class of America. Urbanization, and even some beginning of suburbanization. And what Sloan believed was that not everyone wanted to buy a black Model T Ford. There were some people that were willing to pay more than just for basic transportation. They'd be willing to pay for such things as that their car maybe isn't painted black, maybe a little more colorful. They'd be willing to pay for an enclosed body rather than being out there exposed to the wind and the snow. They might even be willing to pay for electric ignition, rather than having to go out in the snow and turning the crank in the front of the car, and on and on. Lights, things like that. So this was a new way to look at it, that the car wasn't just a piece of transportation equipment for the masses, but in fact it was something else. It was transportation plus what I guess we would now call status, transportation and styling. So that's what Sloan did. He divisionalized GM into the 5 famous divisions. Chevrolet at the bottom to compete with Ford, and then you moved up to Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac for the rich folk. Buick were for the doctors and the lawyers. Cadillac was for the really rich folk. And he got the entire company under control with stringent financial controls, inventory controls. He began to advertise. Ford hated advertising. He began to provide credit. Ford didn't believe that Ford Motor Company should provide credit for potential buyers of Fords. He set up General Motors Acceptance Corporation, GMAC, to provide credit. All those marketing type of things that, of course, are commonplace now in the automobile industry. The net result of this, Ford got prices and costs down. Fords were still the cheapest cars in the market in the 1920s. Chevrolet could not compete with Ford on the basis of price. But Chevrolets had a few extras, options, that Fords didn't have. And even people at the bottom who were just starting out buying cars were willing to pay a little bit more, especially if they could finance the car over time, were willing to pay a little bit more to have a slightly better car, more stylish again. Other people, of course, rather than just saying, well, I'll buy a Model T Ford, really wanted to buy a Buick or a Cadillac. The result of all this was that by 1927, the roles had been reversed. General Motors had virtually destroyed Ford. General Motors was now the dominant automobile company in America. Ford had hit a dead end by just refining the Model T. The entire system that he had embodied in a gigantic plant, the largest plant in the world, what is called the River Rouge plant, still there by the way, the largest plant in the world, was so incredibly specialized that all it could do was produce Model T Fords. The production techniques of General Motors did embody many of the specialized production techniques, but the machines were more flexible. They could be changed to produce slightly different parts, or they could be changed over to produce a new style. And again, Sloan was changing the style of the car every year or two. The annual style change, which became famous in the automobile industry. Flexible production rather than this incredibly specialized production. Ford had hit a dead end. All he could produce were Model T Fords. People weren't buying Model T Fords. He needed a car that was more competitive with the kinds of cars being produced by General Motors. In 1927, he shut down the entire company, laid off something like 60,000 people, and retooled his entire plant. Took him minimum 9 months. He really was out of production for almost 18 months before he was up to full production again. And just had to start from scratch. And he was able to do that because Ford was also the richest company in America, had more cash than any other company in America, but only Ford could have done that. probably the only company in America that could have basically built an entire new company from the ground up, design a new car, design the new machinery, build the new machinery, put it in this gigantic plant, River Rouge plant, and come back into production to challenge once more General Motors. But he had to incorporate the lessons of General Motors. He had to now manage his company more like the way Sloan managed General Motors than the way he managed in the past Ford Motor Company. He was never comfortable with that. And part of the problems that Ford Motor Company always had competing with General Motors, particularly in the last years of Ford's life when he really became kind of nutsy, was to get rid of Ford. Unfortunately, he lived until he was 84 years old, till 1947. But the new management under his grandson, Henry Ford II, had to play catch-up. They had to institute the kinds of systems and management that General Motors had done back in the 1920s. And until the 1980s, Ford always was a distant second to General Motors, both in the American market and, of course, in terms of worldwide sales. So it's the evolution of the American system of manufacturing brought to the extreme, leading to mass production, against the modern corporate form that incorporates not just production, a different kind of production, still trying to keep your costs down, but some flexibility because you have to change your product, but also incorporates what everybody else had learned about marketing, about distribution, about the psychology of why people bought cars and what they were willing to pay for them. And it was that corporate structure and that integration, production, distribution, marketing, and the psychology behind it of how you sell cars, the use of credit, that portended the future, that pointed towards the future for large American corporations. So in the end, it wasn't Ford that was the model for how to run a large, and Ford was, a large company. In the end, the model for how to run a large, diversified corporation was Alfred Sloan and General Motors.